Welcome everyone to Drisha's full program and the first of our three-part series on virtual reality and genuine humanity, Can They Coexist? This session lays out the issues of this course overall and consider the perspective of Jewish law pre-2020 to various scenarios and their relation to virtual reality. It's my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zuckier this evening. Rabbi Zuckier is Drisha's Director of Education and also teaches in the Dr. Beth Samuel's High School program and the Drisha Kollel. A postdoctoral fellow in Jewish Studies at McGill University, he received his PhD in Ancient Judaism at Yale University and was a member of Yeshiva University's Kollel Elyon. Previously, he served as director of the Orthodox Union's Jewish Learning Initiative on campus at Yale University. Shlomo is an alumnus of Yeshivat Har Etzion and REITs, as well as of the Wexner and Tikva Fellowships. He has lectured all across North America, as well as at Yale Divinity School, Yeshiva University, the Tikva Fund, and Bnot Sinai. A founder of the Lehr House, Shlomo serves on the editorial committee of Tradition and has edited 2 books on contemporary Jewish thought. With that, I'll turn this over to you, Rabbi Zuckier.
Okay, thank you, Evie. And as you said, this is the first of a 3-part series where we're going to be examining some of the larger challenges facing humanity, specifically in the realm of virtual reality and the move towards technology, which has been ongoing for some time now in its current phase. The move to we're learning online over Zoom right now. These technologies have existed for a while. Certainly, the fact that the pandemic has been going on for the past 3/4 of a year has stepped up the advancement of these remote interaction technologies and made them really go mainstream. But I guess the larger question is the trajectory we have where interaction is moving more and more to the virtual plane, both interaction between people, but also interaction with just machines as they are. So we're not going to be getting too much into the details of artificial intelligence and all of that. Maybe we'll touch on that in one of the classes, but I think the broader context that we're looking at, the world as it advances, as computers are getting smarter, as technology makes it easier to communicate across distances without having a direct physical contact, what the world looks like and what will change, and particularly what will change about the way we understand each other as people in the process. And so this class aims at tackling that issue from a Jewish perspective, both asking questions of Jewish law, of halacha, and how that plays itself out, and Jewish thought, hashkafa, theology, whatever exactly you want to call it. We're going to spend some time thinking about those questions as well. The plan for these 3 classes today, we're going to start, the first 2 classes essentially are going to focus on the halachic, on the Jewish legal issues, which do have some broader ramifications as well, but we're going to sort of start from more classical Jewish sources. And the 3rd class will focus more on the theology. And the difference between classes 1 and 2, as Evie said, is today we're going to be looking at sources that are all pre-2020, because as we'll see next week, there's been a real takeoff of these discussions about these issues over the past 9 months, out of necessity, obviously, but also in ways that lead in some interesting new directions. So today we're going to do sort of a few different issues about virtual interaction, not directly, not in a direct physical way, and how that plays itself out, and sort of the classical issues. And then next time we're going to look at much more recent issues in Jewish law and how that's played out. And then 2 weeks from now we'll go to even broader questions of hashkafa, theology, and Jewish philosophy. So that's the plan for the next 3 weeks. Just to define our terms a little bit, virtual reality means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I'm going to take the term broadly. So the fact that we're all, well, you can all see me, and I can see some of you, and hopefully more. Everyone's invited to turn on their cameras. That's a function of, I'm not seeing you directly. There's a technology here that allows me to see you virtually. And the same for the fact that we're hearing each other. The fact that we're in a room together, we're virtually in a room together, right? We're not in a physical room, we're in a virtual room. So a technology like Zoom does use virtual reality in some sense. Obviously, there's more extreme forms of virtual reality, such as, I don't know, you plug in, you put on your virtual reality, your VR goggles, and some computer gives you a virtually generated shear with no human producing it. Maybe that's what's going on now. Maybe there's a really advanced technology that's projecting me, but I think it's actually just me. So there are other, down the line, there are other technologies, some of which already exist, some of which are going to exist in the future. We're not going to spend so much time on those per se, because there's sort of less to say about them. There's less that's been discussed, but a lot of the same discussions we're going to have will be applicable for more, more theoretical and more extreme technologies as well. But we're going to be at least starting today. We're going to be thinking mostly about Zoom type technology, video conferencing, but the way it plays itself out in a variety of different ways. And in particular, there are going to be four different issues, four different categories that we're going to be thinking about. I'm just going to post them in the chat box for everyone to see momentarily, and we'll definitely get back to these throughout the class. The four categories of things that sort of shifts are a little different when we're interacting, not in a real physical contact, but virtually, which is number one, verifiability. This is what I was getting at before. How do you know that I'm me? Or how do I know that any of you are actually here? Maybe you're all robots or recordings or something else, right? That's a thing, right? Zoom people, at least some students in school, instead of actually being there, have a video of them pretending to listen to class. So that's a thing that actually exists. So how do you verify that someone's actually there? That's one challenge. Another challenge is human connection. Is the nature of human interaction over virtual means the same? Do we have the same experience? Definitely, I think for anyone who's been to a class in a physical class in the physical world and been to a Zoom class, it's a different experience. There may be some pluses and minuses either way. Some people probably prefer one or the other, but it's certainly a different experience. The human connection is different and arguably is lacking. I'm further away. I'm not, even though we're all talking to each other potentially, I'm somehow more distant because this is virtual. Another factor related but distinct is that of presence. Or you might say at one level, you can say that there are 10 people present in this Zoom room, but at the same time, maybe not, right? Are we really all present together? We'll see how that plays itself out within Jewish law. We'll see how that makes various differences. And then finally, and this is a category with many subsets, is the question of actions. So you're hearing me speak, you're seeing me, you're seeing an image, someone can type in the chat. So those things, hearing, seeing, writing, does that actually constitute all of the above, right? Does typing online count as writing for the purposes of Jewish law? Or you can ask that question in a more philosophical vein, right? Just overall, like is writing, writing with a pen the same phenomenon as typing on a computer, or typing on a computer to someone at a distance? Is that the same thing? And certainly hearing and seeing, phenomenologically and halachically and in every other way, are these the same things? When you hear someone over a video, is that the same as hearing someone in the room live? So those are the questions that are going to come up in the sources that we're looking at, that we're going to look at today. And as was mentioned, we're going to deal with these with a few different issues that are sort of classic issues that touch on these things, including some relatively contemporary, although next week we get hyper contemporary. So I'll pause now. If anyone has any questions about any of these terms or any of these ideas, hopefully they'll all clarify themselves as we go on, but just take a minute for people to ask if they have, and again, to encourage everyone to join on video if they can. If anything, it makes the issues we're discussing more real and relevant, because we'll have more real life examples. But yeah, pause for questions. Yeah, Rebecca, is that a hand or no? Okay, not raising a hand. If not, we'll move forward, and I'm going to share screen for the handout. You also, in the chat, you should have gotten the handout in the chat if you prefer to open it yourself. And also there are different ways of viewing this. You can stop full screen share if you want to see other people, but in any event. So let's jump in. There's a bunch of sources here. We're not going to read probably most of them, maybe not any of them inside. We're going to move through these relatively quickly to get at some of the larger issues at hand. So we'll start with the following issue. Well, we'll start with the overall issue of verifiability, right? The question of, if I'm communicating with someone virtually, how do I know that they're actually on the other end? And we'll start with the issue of the husband's directive to write a get, right? A get, a divorce in Jewish law, is supposed to be written by the husband, but the husband can appoint a messenger, or appoint an agent, can appoint a scribe to write their get, and also is supposed to appoint witnesses to witness, to sign that writ of divorce. So so in the normal case, that's right. The husband goes, he appoints the scribe, he appoints the witnesses, and then they go and do what they do. But what about a case where for example, here we'll read source number 1. Kasav sofer lishma v'chasmu edim lishma. The scribe and the witnesses write what they do with the right intentions. Av b'shekasmu v'chasmu v'nasnu lo v'nasnu la harei get batel. They do the whole thing right. That doesn't, the get, the divorce, is not valid. Ad sheyishmu kolo sheyomar la sofer kso v'la edim chasomu. Unless the scribe and the witnesses hear from the husband directly, right? And until he says to them, right, until they hear that directive to write this divorce document or sign the divorce document, unless they hear it from the husband, the divorce is invalid. So that's the general rule. And this is source number 2. The Shulchan Aruch codifies this as the halacha. Right, sofer v'yichtov v'la edim v'yachtomu lo yichtov hasofer lo yachtomu edim ad shishmu mipiv. They need to hear from his mouth, literally need to hear from the mouth of the husband that he wants them to write this writ of divorce. And the Ramah says, the Ramah says, in a case where the scribe and witnesses don't listen, don't hear from the husband directly, they just decide to do it on their own, or they hear indirectly, right? The husband tells someone who tells them, and then they write the get. That's safek megoreshes. It's doubtful. It's we're not sure whether that's valid. And source number 3, the Chalkas Machloket, explains that there's actually a dispute. There's a Machlokas Rishonim as to whether a divorce that's not directly requested by the husband, but is indirectly requested, there's a dispute as to whether that's valid or not. One of the opinions is source number 4 here is the Ramban, and he says, you can't have someone like find out that they're supposed to write this get. You need to hear directly from the mouth of the husband for it to work. Other opinions, the Ran and the Ra disagree, but this is a dispute, and because there's a dispute, the Ramah says, if the husband goes ahead, or if the scribe and witnesses go ahead and do the divorce process that the husband said he wanted but didn't tell them directly, it's actually safek megoreshes. We're not sure if that marriage has been dissolved or not. Okay, so that's an interesting rule, and there's actually 4 different opinions as to the reason for that, right? Why is it so important that the husband directly tell the scribe and witnesses to write the get? And this is where we're going to start getting to our larger issues. So 4 different opinions as to what this is a function of, what factor comes into play here. Source number 6, the Ri in Tosfos, Rav Yitzchak Dampier, one of the famous Balei Tosfos, says in the underlined piece here, he says he seems to think that this is a function of shlichus, of agency, that there's, just like in many other areas of halacha, there's a requirement of agency. You can either do something on your own or appoint someone else to do it. And sometimes in some areas, like here, there's just a very high bar for what qualifies as agency, what qualifies as shlichus. And that's why you need to tell the scribe and witnesses directly, or the husband needs to, in order for it to be valid. It's a function of agency, of shlichus. That's one view. Another view elsewhere in Tosfos, source number 7, he says, La mishum shlichus, el mishum de kisha lo tziva habal, lo chashiv lishma, el chashiv stamo, pasal the ishlav l'gerishin kaima. It's not a function of agency that the husband hasn't sufficiently appointed the scribe and witnesses as agents. It's rather a specific factor to gittin, that of lishma. There needs to be directed intent, that the person writing the get, the divorce document, needs to intend for it to be for the purpose of the husband and the wife, and he needs some super focused intent. In order to achieve that, he needs to be asked to do it by the husband himself. So those 2 are sort of classic views, but interestingly, you get to more modern times, both the Chazon Ish and Rav Moshe Feinstein have very interesting perspectives that will get to our larger issues. So the Chazon Ish, source number 8 here, and we'll read this inside because it's a fascinating line. He says, if the husband doesn't directly appoint the scribe and witnesses, the lo havi rak kimemanish shluchim shlo b'fneihem. It's not just that he's appointing agents not in front of them. We need the unification of the will of the husband and the scribe and the witnesses at one time. We need a meeting of the minds between all of those parties. The husband has to know the will of the scribe. The scribe has to know the will of the husband. All simultaneously. Without that, you don't have lishma. So this, as opposed to what we saw before in Tosfos, this general idea of lishma, knowing the directionality of who the get's being written for, this is a super lishma, a super idea of really having this, I don't know, mind meld of sorts between the husband and the scribe. And so I guess, and what the Chazon Ish says is, even if you can, tell your friend to tell the scribe to write the get, you may be able to pass along that information, but you don't have this level of yisachtu ratzon haba v'ratzon hasofer, of the mind meld, of the meeting of the minds between the two parties, and that's required in the context of get. So how would we, of the four categories, remember, or look in the chat, the four categories that we have: verifiability, human connection, presence, and formal actions. What category does it sound like the Chazon Ish is focusing on here? What quality is lacking in this case if the appointment of the scribe and witnesses is done indirectly? Okay, maybe 3 or 4. I was actually going to go with 2. I can see the argument for 3, but we'll get to some of the others later. But it's good you jumped in. You get big kudos for jumping in. But I think it's probably a function of human connection. We'll get to presence and action later, but I think human connection is relevant here because, right, there's this idea that you need to have this unification of the minds. You all need to come together. And it sounds like the Chazon Ish is saying you can't do that indirectly. You can't do that through a middleman. You need to actually get together and mind meld together, which is why it's necessarily needs to be in person. And we'll get to the details of that in a minute. That's the Chazon Ish. Rav Moshe Feinstein at Igros Moshe has a different approach. We're not going to read it inside. It's very complicated. But basically he says that if just because someone tells you something doesn't mean it's true, right? Let's say the husband tells his friend to tell the scribe to write the get. The scribe has no reason to believe that the husband actually said that. Okay, someone said it to someone, it's hearsay. There's no basis. So then you might ask, well, what if 2 eidim? What if the husband tells 2 witnesses to tell the scribe to write the get? Even that's not good enough. Even the standard of 2 witnesses is only a standard in court. In the real world, we know 2 witnesses can lie. So there's no reason, the scribe has no reason to believe that the husband actually directed him to do this. And even if he happens to believe him, right, but he knows these people are trustworthy people, doesn't matter. Halacha requires that there's actual knowledge on the part of the scribe that the husband directed him to write the get. And without that absolute knowledge, he can't do it, which is why he has to hear directly from the husband. And which of the 4 categories would we say this is, Rav Moshe Feinstein's approach? Right, you need to know for certain that,
Number 1.
Okay, great. I don't know who said that, but I saw Esty typed it. So Esty and whoever else said it get bonus points, right? So verifiability, this is Rav Moshe Feinstein's view. You need to verify that the husband actually directed the scribe and witnesses to do their part, to write the get. And if you don't have direct instruction, if it's indirect, he told someone to tell one, even if you have 2 aides, maybe if you have 2 witnesses saying that the husband said to write the get, that's still not good enough. A very fascinating and novel view of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Okay, this is all great in theory, right? This is why it needs to be direct. One of these 4 reasons, either it's a function of shlichus, agency, it's a function of lishma, right, of being for the proper intent or proper directedness, or it's this super lishma of the Chazon Ish, of like the mind meld of them coming together, having that connection, or it's the Igros Moshe, the husband needs to, the scribe needs to really know that the husband did it. Okay, and how does this play itself out once we move to modern technology, right? In the time of the Mishnah, you either tell someone or you tell someone to tell someone. That was the best you could do, right? If you wanted to tell someone far away, you sent someone to tell them, right? But what do you do once you have more advanced technology? So just for a quick second before we have that, there actually was old school technology. It was called writing. And that was another way of communicating with people at a distance. So actually the Gemara talks about a person who is mute, who can't speak. So so it basically says they're allowed to nod their head or shake their head and direct someone to write a get in that fashion. And they're also able to write on paper, write a directive to the sofer, to the scribe, to write the get. So apparently, not just the word of from the mouth of the husband, but even things like nodding the head and writing are sufficient. And all four of the theories that we saw would say that that's sufficient for them. But what happens when we move to a newer technology than writing? What about the telephone? So Rav Elimelech Schechter, and some of you may have heard of his son, Rav Herschel Schechter, wrote about this a bunch of years ago. Telephone. So can you use telephone? So he argues that even according to the Ramban, remember the Ramban we said before was the one who said if you don't directly tell the scribe and witnesses, the get is invalid. He said that's true in general. That was true in the olden days. But nowadays, if the husband gets on the phone and calls the sofer and eidim, that's sufficient. Talking on the phone is sufficient. Why? Because the Ramban would agree that this counts as befanav, this counts as in front of him, because it's direct communication, albeit over the phone. So it's direct communication, therefore it should work. So this was a novel view at the time, although he got Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Moshe Feinstein to sign off on it. But there were some who disagreed. Let me just finish this point and then we'll take questions. Some who disagreed. The Mishnah Halachos, Rav Menashe Klein, made two arguments against this view. He says, telephone. Wow. One cannot at all appoint an agent by telephone. So his first objection is you're not actually hearing the voice of the husband. The person, the scribe or the witnesses aren't hearing the voice of the husband. What are they hearing? The husband speaks into the phone. Those sound waves die in that phone. Then there's some electrical current that goes through the phone lines, and there's a new sound that comes out of the sofer's phone. He isn't hearing directly from the husband, and it's necessary to hear directly from the husband. So that's his first objection, and you can all think about which of the four categories is he objecting on the basis of. And then he makes a second objection, and he says that also there you never know. For all you know, the wife wants to get divorced, and she sets up her brother or some other person who can sound like her husband to call up, and they'll know all the details. So you can't verify their identity based on that, and their voice sounds similar enough that they can make it up. So he raises two issues. The second issue is clearly a verification issue, right? How do you know that the person on the phone is actually the husband? Maybe it's someone that the wife put up to do this to pretend that she's getting divorced when she's not actually getting a divorce from her husband. But what was the first factor? Well, we'll get to this more in later sources. The first factor that it's the sound waves from the husband are different than the sound waves coming from the phone of the sofer. Now we're in section 4. Okay, great, Esty, right? The idea that for certain formal actions, here the action of hearing is not being fulfilled. I am not hearing the husband speaking if I'm the sofer. I'm hearing a different sound created by someone else. So that doesn't count. According to the Mishnah Halachos, you need the actual sound from the husband to travel to the sofer for this to work. So that's one objection. And but that's the minority view. A lot of people, a lot of major poskim allowed for a telephone, although not all. So in the standard case, there was always an effort to arrange for an in-person meeting between the husband and the sofer and eidim. And then more recently, in 1994, Rabbi Chaim Jachter, who's a dayan in New Jersey, so he said he wanted to suggest, and that he wrote this article where he said maybe we can have video conference to solve the problem. Okay, on the telephone, you never really know who's on the other side. Maybe that's not good enough, but a video conference, that should be better. And the argument would be it's better on multiple grounds. So it won't solve the problem of virtual hearing, right? Because the active hearing will not be any better. It's no better than a telephone, right? I mean, maybe the sound quality is better, right? But you're still not hearing the original sounds. But fine. But in terms of the two other issues, it actually is better. In terms of the issue of the Chazon Ish's idea of the meeting of the minds, arguably, if you have two people meeting over Zoom. As opposed to over the phone, there's more room for mind melding, for getting on the same page as each other, because you don't just hear each other, you can actually see all the body language, and maybe there's more room in that way in terms of the connection. And in terms of verifiability, this is probably a bigger deal. It's a lot harder to pretend to be someone over Zoom. Although I'll note, it could very well be that we're in like a very funny period of time where Zoom is both popular and hard to trick. I wonder, like 10 years from now, will we have the technology that I can just, instead of me giving the shiur, I can just like write a text and send like the Shlomo avatar out to give the shiur instead, which would actually be a lot of fun, because then I could watch it and argue with it anyway. But right, so I don't know, maybe this is like a weird blip in human history where we have widespread video conferencing without the ability to make it unverifiable. Nowadays, video conferencing is pretty verifiable. So, and it has been since 1994, I guess. So that was Rabbi Jachter's suggestion. However, it did not exactly work. So he sort of retracted 7 years later, 2001, his proposal. Some liked it, YU Poskim, most YU Poskim and Razam Nechemi Goldberg, but Rav Elyashiv and Rabbi Bleich at YU and Rabbi Teitz and Elizabeth they rejected the proposal. So he said, let's try to avoid this, because you never want to do a get that's not widely accepted. Do everything you can to work around it, to have some sort of meeting between the parties. He said maybe in an extreme case where you can't, you wouldn't rely on it. That's what he said then. Stay tuned for next week, Corona updates. But that was the story then. So I think there's some really interesting questions that have come up here on the question of verifiability. And different areas of halacha require the verifiability, or other categories, as we saw. This idea of the husband dictating his intention to write the get may or may not depend on verifiability, but it's a very interesting set of views here, without a full consensus, and at least for now, one would think that verification works a lot better by Zoom than by other means. This comes up in other areas. We're not going to discuss this much, but things like kashrus supervision, right? So if instead of sending people to oversee kashrus of different places, what if you just had a camera there that was looking at all the right places 24/7? You can always check. So is that as good as mashgichim? That's a question that again has come up in the past and has especially come up in recent months. So there's other areas where verification is an important aspect of halacha. We looked at one particular sugya, one particular topic where it comes up a lot, but it comes up in other places. Okay, let's move on in this survey to the category of human connection. And we saw, according to some people, according to the Chazon Ish, it seemed, human connection is the basis actually of our previous topic too. But no, that's not the mainstream view. The mainstream view is that it's about, Rav Moshe Feinstein is about verification, it's about knowing for sure. But what is the story of, where does human connection come up a lot? Actually, it comes up a lot in this sugya of the brachos you say when you see friends. You may or may not have heard of this halacha. It's on the books, but it's rarely practiced, as we're going to discuss. Actually, before we get to that, are there any questions? I should open things up. Okay, Esti.
I'm just curious about the case of someone writing to the sofer. Does that have to happen at that moment, like also in the same like rega, or can
that's part of the question? Yes, there's a whole question there as to how it works as a machlokas haposkim, as to whether like a normal person who can speak has the capacity to choose to just write instead of speaking, or whether that's limited to people who their only mode of communication is speech. So there's a whole question how to apply that, which ties into the other questions. But yeah, otherwise that would be an easy solution here. So we try not to rely on that either, because it's somewhat controversial whether it's broadly applicable. Okay, other questions? Yes, Sarah.
I didn't understand why the rabbi who thought video conferencing was okay, why he withdrew that opinion later.
Well, his reason, Rabbi Jachter, is because there wasn't a consensus, and he said, I thought I had a solution that would make everyone happy. And if it's not making everyone happy, let's rely on other means, if at all possible, right? And in general, divorce is a high stakes thing. You want a divorce to be acceptable by all rabbis. That way, it's not like people will say, "Oh, your divorce is invalid. children from a future marriage will be mamzerim, will be illegitimate under Jewish law. You don't want to be in a situation where the legitimacy of someone's children is a debate among rabbis. You want to work with consensus. So if at all possible, he says there are some exceptions. If there's no other way, and there are other things to rely on in terms of invalidating the marriage in the first place, then maybe you can rely on video conference. But he said generally we shouldn't. And stay tuned for the update next week of what's happened during COVID.
Okay.
Other questions? Okay, so let's jump back. Let's jump back to the handout. And again, we'll talk about this mitzvah or this bracha rather, that one says when they see their friends. So, Amar Yishuv and Levi, Haroes Chaver Lachar Shloshim Yom Omer Baruch Shechianu Kimanu V'Giyanu Lazman Hazeh. We all know about this bracha, Shechianu. We don't usually say it in this context, but it's on the books that when you see your friend after not having seen them for 30 days, you say Shechianu. And Lachar Shnei Asar Chodesh, if you see a friend you haven't seen for 12 months, for a whole year, Omer Baruch Mechayim Mesim, you say a bracha. We know this bracha from Shmon Esrei, but it's a little different here. Baruch Hashem Mechayim Mesim. Blessed are you, God, who revivifies the dead, who brings people back from the dead. I didn't see this person for 12 months. I thought they might have been dead, but turns out they're alive. Baruch Hashem, right? You say a bracha. And so this is brachas on the books are not generally practiced, but let's see how they're discussed. So first of all, source number 16, the Re points out, right? It has to be like a real friend, a close friend, not like a loose friend or a Facebook friend, or I don't know what. It has to be someone you're actually really close with, that you actually are really happy. That's the point of Shechianu. You say Shechianu when you're really happy. So it should have to be a close friend for that reason. And based on this, some people say, well, you're never really sure if it's a close friend or not. You don't want to embarrass someone. You might be overly bracha happy. So better just never to say Shechianu and avoid the problem of saying a false Shechianu on someone who's a false friend or a frenemy or whatnot. But fine. So that's one of the reasons why people often don't say this bracha. But let's move more to our topic. The Shulchan Aruch notes here, right? Again, just like the Gemara. Only if you like them a lot, like Tosfos. And this next piece is going to be more relevant to us. Misha lo ra'as chaver me'olam, v'shalach lo ksavim. You never met your friend before. How is he your friend? You wrote him letters. Is your pen pal. And then, so if you meet your pen pal that you've never met in person before, afal pishahu nehen nabiri yaso, even though you very much enjoy meeting him, right? This is someone you've been in touch with for years. We're writing these letters back and forth. Eino mevarich al riyaso. You don't say a bracha upon meeting him. Why not? Because, and so we're going to see, but presumably the logic here is you don't say a bracha of Mechayim Mesim. Why? Because he's your pen pal. You wrote him a letter last week. You know he's alive. So you don't say a Shechianu because you're just seeing him now because you already know he's alive. But the Aruch HaShulchan points out, this is only true for Mechayim Mesim. Aval in Shechianu, ein chiluk. There's no limitation, there's no distinction in terms of saying Shechianu. Even if you got a letter from this guy within the last month, you still say a Shechianu when meeting him. Why? Why is there a difference between Shechianu and Mechayim Mesim? That time, the Bercha Shechianu he mitoch simchas hara'iyah panim befanim. You say a Shechianu from that special happiness of meeting someone face to face. You only say Mechayim Mesim because you now realize that they're alive, right? That's a verification issue. And you can verify in a bunch of different ways. You can find out through a letter. You don't need to see the person face to face to have verification, but you do to have that special level of happiness. If you know about it through letters or someone mentioned that the person's alive, so this is one of the reasons why we never make Baruch Mechayim Mesim nowadays, because basically we have so much communication that anyone you know and care about, if they were to die, chances are you'd find out about it very quickly. So it's not surprising when you find out that people are alive, even if you haven't directly heard from them in a while, because the nature of communication is such that you would have heard if anything had happened. So we don't say Baruch Mechayim Mesim. But what about Shechianu? The Aruch HaShulchan here says we say Shechianu only in a face-to-face meeting. So let's try to complicate that a bit. Here's the Shut Yechav Das, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, major posting of the 20th century, and he's going to add a couple of wrinkles from 20th century technology. So first, he starts by talking about he brings to the distinction we saw just now in the Aruch HaShulchan that Mechayim Mesim is if you actually find out the person's alive, whereas Shechianu is happy about meeting them. And he says, well, what about, just find the line, right? Fine. So then in the second piece, he summarizes a bit, and he says, what if you meet your friend, don't meet them, actually you see them on television. You hadn't seen this friend in months. Next thing you know, you see them, I don't know, you see them at a sports game in the stands. You see them and you say, b'shiddur chai, a live TV thing. Obviously, if it's a recording, then you're not really experiencing them as alive right now, or you're not experiencing them at all right now. But in a live TV broadcast, do you say a shechianu? I see my friend. I haven't seen my friend face to screen in so long, and now I see them. So do you say a shechianu? So he goes back and forth. He's not sure. He says, in general, safek brachos lahakel, we try to avoid making a bracha when we're not sure. So he doesn't really think you should. But then he quotes the Shud Yama Gadol, a different posek from earlier, who says, Shashomea kolo shel chavero, b'telephone o b'radio mevarich olav shechianu. He says, not only for TV, you say a bracha of shechianu, you even say a bracha of shechianu for hearing the person on the radio or the telephone. So what do we have here? It sounds like, right, first we have the distinction between Mechayim Mesa, which is about verifying that the person's alive, which is a pretty low bar. You can do that by letters, by radio, by television, but then between that and shechianu, which is about this higher bar of experiencing the person, right? Experiencing the person one-to-one, human connection, having that reconnection, and it makes you very happy. And the question is, does that work? Does that work virtually? Does that work over the telephone? Does it work over radio? Does it work over television? And we see it's a machlokas, it's a dispute over where to draw the line. What exactly counts as that human connection that makes you happy enough to say a shechianu, right? And there's a dispute here. Rabbi Yosef's not sure about television. It seems like he doesn't think radio is or phone is too much, but the Yama Gadol thinks even radio or telephone is sufficient to say a shechianu because you're happy enough that you've actually interacted with this person. So really, again, a fascinating question here about human interaction. And I guess we can if we think about how technologies change and how the world changes, it makes you wonder, like the fact that we interact now more, we interact more, I don't know, very often through phone, right? If you're going to meet someone, probably in the olden days, if you wanted to talk to your friend, you had to meet them in person. Nowadays, you call them on the phone, right? Now they really currently a video call. So in what direction does that shape the nature of human interaction? Meaning, does it become that a phone call is the same thing as seeing someone face to face because it's become more common, or do we somehow have like a hierarchy of interactions, right? A face to face still retains something special to it, and virtual interaction is lacking. And maybe you can say, as the potential, as the ease of access through virtual means becomes more common, maybe the direct human interaction actually becomes more precious. There was this article in the New York Times about a year and a half ago asking whether like direct human interaction is becoming like a luxury item. Not everyone can afford direct human contact. So maybe in some ways it actually becomes more significant, and we drive a bigger gulf between direct human interaction and virtual interaction. So that's sort of a big thought question, worth reflecting on it as we think about some of these larger issues of the direction humanity is going in. If you take like an extreme scenario like the Matrix, right? So no one is physically in touch with anyone, right? It's all virtual, but it feels like it's naturally in-person interaction. So you get a bit of a I don't know, paradox or a complication there. As technologies get better, on the one hand, you have more capacity to interact, and on the other hand, maybe that makes actual interaction more potent in some way. All right, let's move on. Or questions? Any questions on this issue of saying shechianu or other brachos? Yeah, Esti.
Yeah, I have two questions. One of them is in Rabbi Vadia's tshuva. Is it specifically like he's having like a one-way broadcast? Like it's not like his tshuva and his uncertainty was specifically like if you see someone on television and they don't see you and don't know that you're interacting with them?
Yeah, and I think what you're implying is, right, maybe it's the one-sided nature of it that affects it, right? So yeah, that could very well be, and maybe I don't know if he ever answered this. Maybe a Zoom call, he would say, actually, is better than television. Maybe that would qualify, right?
Yeah.
Certainly the Yom HaGadol was talking about both radio and the telephone call, right? Phone call obviously is two-way, but but it's, it's only sound. So maybe, right? So maybe Ravadia was less impressed by that because it was sound. But maybe if it was both sound and, it's audio and visual, and it was real-time two-way communication, maybe that would be better, right? I don't know. I didn't look further for other posts to talk about this. I think as probably I'm guessing people here haven't been practicing that Shechianu bracha and haven't seen people doing it. I assume people generally hedge against it. Although I did see, what did I see? Rav Aviner in Israel is like a fan of saying the Shechianu, at least sometimes in practice. So yeah, I see someone posted, what if there's a few minute delay? So certainly Rav Avadia seems to think the delay would ruin it. And maybe if it's a few minutes, it'll be different. It sounds like he really wants it to be live. And I guess that's an interesting question. In terms of, I guess that affects a couple of things, right? Certainly the experience of seeing someone, if it's not live, is not the same. The best proof for that is, try telling someone that they can watch the game later after it's recorded, and they're never going to want that, right? Something lacking about it. Maybe with TV shows it's different now. I don't know. We have to think about that. If everyone's binge watching their TV shows instead of watching them live. But at least live events, as opposed to recorded events, there's something about watching them live. So presumably that's what everybody is saying. But yeah, it's interesting question to raise. A few minute delays that make a difference according to everyone. Judy.
Are you showing that in the case of seeing a friend, the bar is set lower than in the case of giving a get? Because it is so much more acceptable or more often accepted by poskim that radio, telephone, TV, there are all these other virtual methods that do apply to Shechianu, but where they might not apply it to a get. So there's something more stringent about the get in terms of virtual connection?
Maybe. I mean, definitely the get is a more stringent thing overall. Right here, the stakes are whether you say a Shechianu or not. In the case of get, whether a get is good or not is, rabbis try to be super careful that number one, that the people who should be having a get should, right, to not prevent that, but also that every get that's given is widely accepted. So the stakes are much higher there. Ish mamzer, so the reasons I mentioned before. But I think in addition to that, it's sort of just different issues, at least according to most opinions. According to everyone other than the Chazon Ish, that the get issue is this mind meld between the husband and the sofer. According to most people, it's either an issue of verification or an issue of like sufficient intention in appointing the. So it's sort of a different standard. And so yeah, there's like it's a different category, and there's that stringent aspect. So I didn't. I'm sure you can compare different poskim, like where they come out on the two issues and line them up, and you may see people coming out on different sides in different places. But I think it's mostly just qualitatively a different thing. Can a blind person say Shechianu? So I didn't see a discussion about that. There is a discussion about blind people saying a different bracha when you see a king. There's a bracha that you say when you meet a king, and the question is that the Gemara talks about seeing a king. So the question is, can a blind person who's not seeing the king but is present when there is a monarchic procession and they get the same rush and they have the same experience, they know what's going on, do they say the bracha or not? So I forget who it is. One of the Achronim, I'm not remembering. I saw one of the Achronim says that you do say a blind person does say the bracha, and I saw. I note this in at the end, one of the readings, David Lichtenstein in his book, he says that watching a monarchic procession or watching a king by video is sort of the opposite case of the blind person who's there in person, right? Because on the one hand, you can see the king, probably, assuming that counts as sight, but you're not there. You're not there live. You don't have that same excitement. So he said probably it would be the opposite, that if a blind person live does say the bracha, a person watching on video at home who can see isn't part of that experience and wouldn't say the bracha. That was his suggestion. It's an interesting idea. So can a blind person say Shechianu about this? I think that would be an interesting parallel discussion. I didn't see anyone talking about it, but I assume it's okay. If there are no other questions, let's jump back to the handout. And we'll talk now about presence. and not like Hanukkah presents, which anyways are a made-up thing based on Christianity, but don't spoil it for the kids. But presence, being there. So yeah, we're going to focus on minyan because that's the core issue that comes up here a lot. It comes up a lot historically, but I'd say it comes up even more so in the context of the past 9 months, and we'll spend a fair amount of time on this next time. You need a minyan for prayer, a quorum. That comes from the Mishnah and Megillah. Ein over lifnei ateva, you can't have chazars or shots and also a minyan. Ella pachos me'asar, right? If you have less than 10, understood in Orthodoxy as 10 adult Jewish males, you can't have a minyan under those contexts. And that's the Mishnah. The question is why. The basic source is the basic source that people tie this into is a Gemara in Brachos that says, how do you know 10 people who are davening that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is with them? God is present in the community of God. If there's a community, and there's a whole derivation as to a community being a minyan, then God is present. So we see from here that God is present in a minyan. So first of all, the main sort of presence that we're talking about is the divine presence. A minyan generally correlates with a divine God being present. But it's pretty hard to figure out what makes God present independent of a minyan. So let's try to focus on what counts as a minyan and what sort of human presence is necessary for a minyan to work according to traditional Jewish sources. There is a fair amount of conflict or dissent among different Jewish sources. They sort of pull in different directions. But you know, a couple of Gemaras, but we'll get to the consensus. So source number 22, it says, right? This is Birkas Kohanim. You never want to get stuck behind the Kohanim because then you don't count for the bracha. You want to be in the right place. Continuation, the Gemara says, right? Even if there are, an iron curtain, a metal wall, that wouldn't separate between Israel and their Father in heaven. What does that mean? That's understood by some to mean, well, you can be in different places and join for a minyan. The problem with that is the source number 23 here talks about if you have tzibur b'gdola v'shliach tzibur b'ktana. But if you have the chazan in one room, let's say a small room, and the rest of the community, you have the minyan in a big room, then that works. But if you have the tzibur b'ktana, shliach tzibur b'gdola, you have the community in a small room, and the shliach tzibur in a big room, that doesn't work. That doesn't count as a minyan. Tisha b'gdola v'yachid b'ktana mitzdarfen, tisha b'ktana v'yachid b'gdola ein mitzdarfen. Again, you have these two adjoining rooms. You have 9 in one and 1 in the other. It needs to be set up a certain way. The point is, without getting into all the details, you need to have 10. You need to have the full quorum in the room in order for the minyan to work. With one exception, if it's the 9 are in the big room, the 1 is in the small room, and they're connected. But in a normal room, you need to have the minyan in the room for it to work. So how do you resolve this with the earlier Gemara? People generally understood that first Gemara, that there's no separation in terms of davening. That's in terms of saying Amen, right? You can't form the main minyan, the main part of the minyan, if you're not in the same room as the minyan. If the minyan is in a room, you're in a different room or different building, you can't be a part of the core 10, but you can answer Amen. You can sort of add on to them. You can't be part of the core 10. That's the standard view from the Ravid as to how we do that. And it's brought down the Shulchan Aruch here, source 24. You have the minyan in one room. The person can answer Amen in a different room. And some say that you can only do this as long as there's no separation between that person and the minyan of something disgusting, let's say feces or idolatry. That would sort of break your minyan chain. But other than that you can be an add-on to the minyan from somewhere else. You can't be a part of the minyan from somewhere else. So now things get a little complicated though, because the Rashba talks about what the minhag was, the practice was, that you'd have in shul, you'd have the main shul, you'd have everyone in shul, and where would the chazan be? So the chazan would be on the bima, on a little raised platform, not any old bima. There would be walls around the chazan, high walls. So essentially the chazan would be in his own room, and everyone else would be in the shul, which is surrounding the chazan's room. So here's the problem. The chazan is supposed to be in the same room as the minyan. So how does this work? So the Rashba gives two answers. Number one, he says, well, the shul is constructed in such a way that, you know, the chazin's room, the chazin's platform is really part of the shul. Because it's designed together, even though technically there's walls and whatnot, it's not really a separate room. That's his first answer. His second answer, we'll read this inside, and he's not sure about it. He suggests it. Odani Omer she'efshar lomar. You might say shekol shero in elus elu ki'ilu hein bevayis echad dami umitzdarfin. As long as the chazan can see the people and the people can see the chazan, they all can see each other. That counts as if they're all in the same room, and they can add them for a minyan, right? Then the minyan works. So what's our standard now? We have a little bit of a problem, right? Remember, what we said before, the consensus coming out of the Gemara was you need to have a quorum plus the chazan. They need to be in the same room. What is that based on? That's based on presence, very simply, right? You need to be in the same room. You all need to be present in the same room. But now we're saying there's this different standard of roin elus elu. They can see each other. And even if they're in different rooms, right? That's what the Rashba is suggesting tentatively. It's not only the Rashba, source number 26, the Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch, in his lengthier writing, he quotes some earlier sources, some Gaonim, who talk about people who are not in shul, they're sort of outside of shul, but they stick their head in the window and they can then count. And there's a question as to what exactly that means. Let's look at source 27. This is the Shulchan Aruch codifying the halacha here in a very, very confusing way. So let's read a few of these lines together, try to figure this out, and then try to see the ramifications here. So number one, right, Sif Yud Gimel, 13. For a minyan to work, you need to have everyone in the same place. They all need to be present in the same place with the shliach tzibur along with them, right, with the chazan. What if you're in the doorway? So it depends which side of the door you're on. If you're in the doorway on the part that the door would close, you'd be outside, you're outside. If you're on the inner part of the doorway, you're inside. Fine. You're outside the shul. And there's a window. I feel it's a high wall. I feel in a Rachav Arba, it's a small window. Umar lehem panim misham. You show them your face from there, from outside. Now he doesn't say you stick your head inside. He says you show them your face. It sounds like you don't even stick your head in. Mitzdarif imayim lasara. You can be counted for the 10. So you can have, you know, let's say you have one person outside like that, or you can have 3 people outside like that in theory. You have 7 people in the shul, you have 3 out the window, they can see each other. That counts for a minyan, despite the fact that they're in different buildings. And then the Ramah points out also the roof doesn't count as part of the shul. Okay. And now Tezvav, imikzasam bifnim, umikzasam bachutz, if you have half the minyan inside, half the minyan outside, ushliach tzibur tocha pesach, you have the chazan sort of straddling both inside and outside in the doorway. Tumitzarfan, the chazan can count for both sides because he can presumably, because he can see one side, he can see the other side, they're all together. So what is going on here? What's the standard for minyan according to the Shulchan Aruch? Is the standard presence? You all need to be in the same room, period. Or is the standard being able to see each other, which would presumably be, you know, category 4, the ability to see. As long as you can see each other, you count as the same minyan. It's really not clear. There's a tension here. Well, there's a lot of arguments back and forth as to how to understand this. Practically, the Mishnah Berurah says, and people have relied on this recently, but we'll talk about that more next week. He says, really, as long as you can see each other, that's fine. All the cases that talk about, they all need to be in the same room, that's only if they can't see each other. But if they can see each other, they actually don't need to be in the same room. So presence is not the absolute requirement. The minimal requirement is roin elu elu, but you shouldn't rely on that unless you have to. If that's the basic din, that's the basic rule, but you shouldn't rely on that. You should try to be stringent and make sure there's actually a full minyan in the room. That's the Mishnah Berurah's ruling, and that's sort of the mainstream view. So that's in terms of forming a minyan. In terms of saying amen, source number 29 here talks about the great synagogue in Alexandria, which was so big that people couldn't hear the chazan. They didn't have microphones back then, or even if they did, they might not work. Stay tuned for that. So they couldn't hear the chazan. So what they would do is they would pick up a flag when it was time to say amen, and people would say amen. So we learn from this source that you can say amen even if you didn't actually hear the bracha, as long as you know the right time. Presumably that sounds like a standard of verification, right? As long as you can verify that the right time to say amen is now, you say amen even if you didn't actually hear the bracha. How does this all play out in practice? And when I say in practice, I mean in practice prior to the last 9 months. So there's, let's see, source number 32, if we jump ahead a bit, there was a minyan in Teaneck, my hometown. They had a internet minyan. What does internet minyan mean? It means in shul, there was an actual physical minyan, present together, and they would broadcast that minyan to the outside for people who wanted to say Amen. People who couldn't make it to shul wanted to still be able to say Amen to all the brachos, say Baruch Hu. They can respond at a distance. That's the internet minyan. But no one, as sources 30 and 31 say, no one was making a minyan where the minyan was formed based on people in different places. One person in their house, one person in their house, all joining together. That didn't exist. No one was doing that. That's been the standard. That's the standard view. That some exceptions, like we saw, like people in inside a shul and outside a shul, maybe you can do that, even though that's not ideal. But certainly, making a minyan over webcam, no one was doing certainly before 2020. So again, next week we'll talk about 2020. But that's the view. Webcam doesn't help you. It can help you verify. It can help you know when to say Amen, when to say Heshmei Rabbi, when to say Baruch Hu. But what it cannot do is form a minyan. You can't do anything that you would generally do with a minyan over Zoom, because the people are in different rooms, and that's not good enough. And it also doesn't count as Roam Elos Elo. It's not good enough to say that people see each other, and that can qualify. So much for presence. We focused on it in terms of this halakha. Right. And we'll next time I think we'll talk a bit more about how the definition of presence might change, how there are different ways of thinking about it. I'd say if we go to like extreme versions of reality, right? Like in the Matrix, where everyone is only virtually, basically only exists virtually. Their body somewhere, but their whole life is on the virtual plane. It makes you wonder, like, would presence shift in one way or other, or even in less extreme ways? I had this funny story with my 3-year-old, where she was talking about she wanted to go on Zoom. So she said, okay, Abba, I want to go on Zoom, but I want it to be a real Zoom. Like, what's a real Zoom? Like there's this idea of a fake Zoom. I don't know if it was a recording. I don't know what it was, but she wanted it to be a real Zoom. So our perception of what's real and what's virtual is also shaped by our experiences. And if you're someone who a pretty high percentage of your life experience was over Zoom as opposed to in person, you might move in that direction too. So there's what to think about in terms of how presence shifts, and also this complicated factor of the human presence to form the minyan, and then the divine presence that somehow joins them. And it's the only way we can really access or understand the divine presence is based on the standard of human presence. I don't know how else we would figure out where God dwells other than by this standard that's relevant here, but that's an important question. Okay, our last issue, as we're behind on time, we'll hold questions for after that, and hopefully we'll try to keep this last thing to 5 minutes, and then we'll take questions so I won't be holding you for too long. And this may be the largest issue, is defining various actions. How do you define seeing? How do you define hearing? How do you define writing? All these are difficult to do. Some Gemara about testifying about the new moon, if the witnesses say that they saw the moon in a reflection or something like that, then they can't testify about it. Question there is that about verification? They're not sure they actually saw the moon. Maybe it was a light bulb, I don't know, not in the time of the Mishnah. Or is it about the need to see things directly? Maybe seeing something in a reflection isn't actually considered seeing the thing. Source 34, someone blows a shofar into a pit and then hears not the shofar itself, but the rebound, the echo of the shofar, lo yatsa. You don't fulfill the mitzvah of shofar. Why? Presumably you need to hear the shofar itself. Now, is that a special rule of shofar? Is that a general rule about mitzvahs? Not fully clear, but one might extrapolate from here that you need to hear the actual sound itself as opposed to some echo. And just remember what we saw before. We saw in the Mishnah Halachos, in the case of the husband calling the shofar and telling him to write the get, the Mishnah Halachos says that doesn't count. Why? Because it's on the phone, and if you hear someone on the phone, you're not actually hearing them. So the Mishnah Halachos there was based on source 35 here, the Minchas Shlomo, or Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who famously argued that you can't fulfill mitzvos over a microphone or over the phone or equal ramifications for a hearing aid potentially as well. All the different things that project voice. Well, they're not actually projecting the voice. What they're actually doing is they're hearing something and then they're sending out a new sound, right? Like on a telephone. The telephone hears one thing on one end and it says the same thing, sounds the same on the other end, but it's totally different sound waves. Same thing, apparently the physics is the same with a microphone, it's the same with the hearing aid and all of these things. So the Minchas Shlomo, the Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says you can never fulfill any mitzvos involving microphones or the like, because you're not actually hearing the thing itself. Rav Moshe Feinstein, Eger's Moshe, argues with this view and says, it's not really true. Meaning the idea of when I speak, you hear the same exact sound waves. That's not really true either. There's a delay from, sound waves take time to travel. There's a delay between getting from me to you. It's not like we have such high standards for defining sound. If I speak and you hear, and it's a direct correlation and it's immediate, that's more or less immediate, that's good enough. And so I speak into a phone and you hear me, that counts. If I speak into a microphone, then the microphone, a split second later, it blasts it louder, that's good enough to count. But Rav Moshe Feinstein says, and we're not trying to, people always like new things and gimmicks. We'll encourage people not to rely on this, although technically this does work. So in the Tzitz Eliezer, so the standard view has been, as Roy Jacker says, in theory, a lot of poskim were okay with it. In practice, though, mid and late 20th century authorities reject the use of microphones for performance of mitzvot, with the possible exception of Torah reading, because it doesn't count as actually hearing the voice of the person speaking. And so we're not going to get more into this now, because we're going to spend a lot of time on it next week. The question of both sound and sight, right? Both seeing and hearing, and maybe writing too. Does it actually count to fulfill various mitzvos? And I would add, not just about fulfilling mitzvos, it's also doing averos, right? If you write on Shabbos with a pen, that's a biblical prohibition. What if you type on a computer on Shabbos? Is that a biblical prohibition? Well, does it violate the prohibition of writing? Well, that depends on whether writing on a computer counts as writing or not. Same thing if you have a video call, that may tie into similar issues. We'll get into that more next week. Both mitzvos and averos, positive and negative things that may come into play when using technology, and especially as they've been discussed over the last 9 months. Right. And one, we can take this to an extreme, just thinking theoretically, just for a few more seconds. If you think that the interaction that someone has over the computer screen is real, right? If you think that you're actually hearing me speak right now, right? Which again, you could argue it either way, right? Either you're hearing me speak or no, you're not hearing me speak. I'm speaking in the room that I'm in right now, and those sounds end here, and then you're hearing a different projection. Each of you is hearing your own projection from your computer that's totally separate from you. Once you say that hearing virtually counts, when there's a person on the other end, what happens when there's no person on the other end? What happens if it's totally projection of your computer, right? Let's say your computer can, again, have the virtual Shlomo talking to you. So would that count? Or take it even further. Let's say you hook yourself up to a virtual reality device, everything feels totally real, and I don't know, you want to read a virtual Torah in your VR machine, or let's say you eat something not kosher, you eat bacon, like real bacon in your VR machine. So you're not eating any physical bacon, but it feels as if you are. So does that count? These are great theoretical questions that we're not going to necessarily answer, but some of the questions we're raising actually tie in to these broader questions. So I've gone over time. I'm going to pause now for questions and thoughts. I see there are a couple of questions posted in the chat. Are there not Hasidic rabbis who daven in their own room and you could not see them? Yes, not only in the past, in the present also. Some Hasidic rabbis have their own room where they daven, and presumably that wouldn't work if they were the number 10. That would only work if they were the +1. They already had a minyan without them, they're the +1, then they're not a core part of the minyan, they're sort of an add-on to the minyan. I think for the Hasidic rabbis, the idea was their kavanah, their focus, and the devotion was so important that it overrode the idea of them being a core part of the minyan. But that's already an area of Hasidic theology that we're not going to get into now. Okay, it was apparently a Jewish Action magazine article about it. I'll have to see that. Any other questions on any part of this shir? Okay, if not, so stay tuned for next week when we're going to get into more recent COVID-related things, especially on issues of presence and hearing and seeing and the like, and how those have played themselves out during the pandemic. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll get into issues of theology as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Zuckier, for an interesting first class of this series. Looking forward to next week and the following. And thank you everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We continue our full program tomorrow, Tuesday at 1 p.m. with the second of a four-part series on living and dying with dignity, themes in halakha and medical decision-making with Rabbi Reifman. In addition, we have many more classes happening right now. You can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes or watch live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again for this opportunity to learn with you, Rabbi Zuckier. And thank you to everyone who attended. We hope to see you soon at one of our upcoming classes here at Drisha. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.